Okay, so this is going to be part one of the presentations that take a look at the legislative branch. In this particular presentation, we're going to look at the structure of both houses of Congress, as well as the people that are in them and how the leadership structure works, as well as a little bit of the differences between the two houses. All right, let's get started. So first, of course, our Congress is bicameral, right? Remember that word bicameral, meaning that there's two houses in Congress. There's the House of Representatives and there's the Senate. So, of course, first it would be important to talk about being very specific about what's different about them so that we can kind of wrap our heads around this idea of why we have both. So the biggest difference, first off, is just the sheer numbers of people in each. So the House of Representatives has 435 members, and that's quite a few members, obviously. And they stick around for about 2 years. We vote for the folks in the House of Representatives, and who will represent us, of course, every 2 years. In the Senate, they have 100 members, which is quite a bit smaller, right? And we vote for Senate members for every 6 years. So let's take a look at those numbers. Again, you'll remember that the Senate has all of their numbers based off, having equal Senate members per state. So every state has two. So California has two, Rhode Island has two. It doesn't really matter the size of the state or however many people live there. It's just straight up two. So two per state, 50 states equals 100 members. So obviously there's just fewer of those. Now in the House, as a reminder, the number of representatives is based on population. So California is the most populous state in the country. So we actually have 53 representatives in our House of Representatives. So if we're looking at Senate, of course, we have two senators, but we have 53 representatives of in the House. So when it comes to thinking about if ever you have an issue and you want to call and hassle somebody in Congress to help move forward with an idea that you have, who are you going to call? Are you going to call one of the senators where, there's only two people that have to figure out everything that's going on in the whole state? Or are you going to call like Mike Thompson, who really only has to focus on just Napa and those areas? Generally speaking, you will call that member of the House of Representatives because since there's so many per the state, it allows them to focus on smaller areas and means that Mike Thompson really only has to care about stuff happening in Napa and Sassoon and those areas and doesn't have to figure out all of what's going on throughout the whole state. Makes the House of Representatives folks significantly more receptive to, listening to individual people like you or I. But aside from that, the House of Representatives also has a low turnover, which means that folks that are elected as representatives to the House of Representatives, they tend to stick around for a while. They tend to get voted in fairly frequently, tend to get reelected. So they don't tend to, elect new people, and there's not kind of like this rotating band of people all of the time. Whereas in the Senate, they have a little bit more of a moderate turnover. The Senate tends to have fewer members that stay as representatives in the Senate for long periods of time. And in part, that has to do with the fact that there's only two per state. So you can imagine that if folks in a state are getting frustrated with, whichever party their Senate members, are in, then they might want to just be done with it and elect people from the other party. Whereas, again, since the House people can focus on smaller geographic areas, people tend to build closer relationships with them, and it tends to be a little bit less based on party stuff in the House and more based on stuff that a geographic area needs. Also in the House, the scheduling and the rules and all of this stuff that they decide on to help make things operate are pretty much decided by a powerful rules committee. So there's a committee in the House that decides all of these things, regardless of party, regardless of whatever. There's just a committee that figures this stuff out. So the amount of time for debates, amendments to stuff, all those sorts of things, all of the rules are determined by a committee. But in the Senate, the majority party and the minority party leaders actually collaborate and figure stuff out together. So actually in the Senate, things tend to be structured a little bit more democratically than they are in the House. the House operates a little bit more like a republic, in using our terminology, of course. So a number of the main differences are, also related just to the way that operations work in each of the houses. And one of the major issues is that when they're talking about instituting a bill or making changes or whatever, when it comes to debating those issues in the House of Representatives, each topic of debate is limited to 1 hour. They only have 1 hour to debate whatever issues come up, and after that hour passes, tough. Whether or not you've said all of the things that you needed to say, or any decisions have been made, or anyone is able to compromise now, tough, sucks. 1 hour is it, and after that, it's done. In the Senate, however, they are allowed to debate on issues basically forever. We'll look a little bit more at this keyword known as a filibuster. You may have heard of it before. We'll continue to discuss it. But a filibuster is basically when someone in the Senate goes up and then just takes the floor for debate and then just speaks forever and makes it so that they never sit down, they don't stop talking, and it can actually stall the process of debate. So, of course, you may think that this unlimited time for debating in the Senate is helpful, and in some ways it is, but it also has drawbacks as well. So it's just a little bit of a difference. I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a pro or a con, but I'm hoping that you, of course, will have the ability to make your own opinions on which of those processes you think is more effective. In the House, the members of the House tend to be policy specialists. So each of the folks that serve in the House of Representatives tend to be fairly specifically focused on particular issues. So of course, since Mike Thompson represents the Napa Valley, it would be reasonable to assume that he's kind of an agriculture policy specialist, right? Because we have a lot of agriculture stuff here. So he kind of goes in and has his own focus of things that he knows a fair amount about, and then just kind of stays out of debates on issues that he doesn't know that much about. It allows him to focus on particular issues that his area cares about more, right? But in the Senate, the folks tend to be policy generalists. They tend to know a fair amount about most policy issues. Of course, if there's only going to be 2 senators for California, then both of them sort of have to know all of the issues that California cares about, right? They can't really divide that up because there's only 2 of them. So it forces them to kind of have to be more general about some of the things that they know about, but it, of course, also sort of means that they will probably know less about each of the individual issues than perhaps a policy specialist would. The House, of course, it's worth just sort of noting that the House, when they move forward with creating new laws, when they start the process to make new laws, they tend to like to focus on tax and revenue stuff. They tend to be a little bit more focused on money stuff. Whereas the Senate, they actually tend to be a little bit more focused on foreign policy stuff. It's just sort of the way that it's shaken out. It isn't like that's specifically what their purposes are, sort of the way that it goes. And also in the House of Representatives, their processes seem to be a little bit more formal. Things are a little bit more impersonal, probably as a result of there just being so many of them, right? But in the Senate, things are a little bit more informal, and their relationships and interactions tend to be a little bit more personal. Again, in part, probably related to the fact that it's just easier to get to know 100 people than it is to get to know over 400. So, when it comes to the party structure, as we'll take a look, the political party that the members of the houses represent matters a fairly significant amount. We'll talk a little bit more later about how that matters politically and how that can, help or hinder the ability for new laws or decisions to be made. But just the sheer numbers of them also structures the way in which leadership works. So I wanted to include this graph here just so that you can see, so our current 114th U.S. Congress, this is the division party-wise of who's in each house. So in the Senate, of course, we have 54 Republicans, 44 Democrats, and then 2 of those are independents. So that means that they're of a political party that is not Republican or Democrat, or they just don't align with a political party. And in the House, we have 246 Republicans and 188 Democrats. And at the time of this particular graph, there was actually one vacancy. And that's because Michael Grimm, who was a Republican representative from New York, resigned after he was convicted for tax evasion. So that's pretty cool. Convicted of a crime, so he resigned. So I guess in part that might give you a little bit of a look at the way in which things can change, or how people can quit or resign or die or whatever, and how that can influence the numbers. But most importantly on this page is the fact that you can see that as of our current Congress, we have, while it may look slight, it's a pretty significant Republican majority in both the Senate and the House. So both of our houses in the legislative branch are pretty well dominated by Republicans at this time. And I'll show you sort of why that matters basically now, I guess. So the way that both houses are structured is that there is majority party leadership and there is minority party leadership. So of course, as we just noticed, that the Republican Party has the majority in both houses. So then that means that in both the House and in the Senate, that the majority party and the majority party leadership lies with the Republican Party. So let's take a look at what each of those roles are and who the people are that fall into those roles. So first, the most important role in the House of Representatives, of course, is the Speaker of the House. And in many ways, this role is basically just the leader of the House of Representatives. It's the person that kind of operates to help manage everything, sort of serves as their leader. And at this time, it's Paul Ryan, who you've probably heard a fair amount about. He's in the news fairly frequently because, of course, he's the Speaker of the House. Especially because he ended up taking over as Speaker of the House after John Boehner resigned, somewhat surprisingly last year. So that was kind of a big deal. You may remember that. Anyway, so underneath Speaker of the House, we have the Majority Leader. And this is Kevin McCarthy, and of course is a Republican, because all of these folks are Republicans, because of course this is the majority party. So while the Speaker of the House is like the leader of the whole House of Representatives, basically, the Majority Leader, for the most part, serves as the leader of the majority party only. So it's sort of his job to be the representative of and kind of the face of all of the Republican representatives in the House of Representatives, regardless of state. The Majority Leader serves as the leader of all the Republicans. And underneath that position is what is known as the Majority Whip. And he's kind of like second in command for the majority party. And of course, this is Steve Scalise, and he's a Republican, of course, as well. And what the Majority Whip does is it's actually their job to try to help basically whip their party into shape. It's kind of where this idea of Majority Whip comes from. And what he does is he tries to make sure that he can get all of the other folks that are Republican in the House of Representatives to try to go along with the Republican Party line. It's kind of his job to help encourage folks to kind of move forward doing that. Of course, the House of Representatives, since they can focus a little bit more on individual geographic areas, doesn't always work especially well, but that's what his job is. And just to let you know for how these folks get their jobs, is generally speaking, the Speaker of the House is the highest ranking member of the majority party in the House. So at this time, it's Paul Ryan. For the most part, highest ranking kind of means that they've been there the longest. But in some cases, as with Paul Ryan, just sort of means that he has a fair amount of support of the other Republicans. That they just kind of appreciate him in general and appreciate the idea of him being their leader. With Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise, it sort of functions the same way. I would just say that they are like second and third in line behind, the level of seniority of Paul Ryan. And then, of course, with the other positions, as you can see on the left, is there's the chairman of their caucus. So caucuses are involved in the process for campaigns. We'll take a look at those later. But high-ranking Republican member is in charge of their caucuses, as well as in charge of their own Republican Congressional Committee, which is just a committee related to congressional issues for the majority party. Okay. So next, of course, is the minority leadership. So since the Democrats are the minority party right now, they are the ones that have the minority leader and the minority whip. Now, of course, it probably makes sense to you and is fairly obvious, but if it turns out that in the next election cycle that it ends up that more Democrats are elected into the House of Representatives than Republicans, then of course the minority party would then shift to the majority party, right? And then it would mean that the highest ranking Democrat right now, Nancy Pelosi, serves as the minority leader. But if the Democrats were to become the majority, then Nancy Pelosi would then become the Speaker of the House because she would be the highest ranking person in the majority party then. But for right now, since they're the minority, she just serves as the minority party leader. And for the most part, minority leader in the House does pretty much exactly the same thing as the majority leader does in the House, just sort of serves as the representative. You've probably heard of her fairly frequently, in part because, of course, she's from California, but also because she serves as the face of the minority party. Then the minority whip, is Steny Hoyer. Of course, he serves as doing the same stuff as the majority whip, kind of works towards trying to encourage all of the Democrats in the House to try to do the things that the Democratic Party wants them to do, to try to push forward and kind of force compromise, and force for them to be able to get a majority, right? That's kind of the point of the whips. Of course, the minority party and Democrats at this time also focus on the policy committees. They are in charge of the Committee on Committees, which is sort of an insane kind of thing to think about, but it's literally they are allowed to be in charge of the committee that helps determine what the committees will be, basically. And then, of course, they're also responsible for the Democratic congressional campaign stuff. So let's keep moving on. So in the Senate, things are a little bit different. While the Speaker of the House was in charge of the House of Representatives, he was sort of the highest ranking member. In the Senate, the highest ranking member is actually the Vice President of the United States. So at this time, of course, it's Joe Biden. So in many ways, being the Vice President is kind of like second fiddle. He doesn't really have a whole lot of specific just vice presidential stuff to do, aside from being second in line to the President. But really, being in charge of the Senate is like the biggest thing that the Vice President does. That's sort of his gig. But after that, of course, just like in the House of Representatives, the highest next ranking stuff is connected to the majority party, which, again, the majority party in the Senate, just as in the House, is the Republican Party. So underneath the president of the Senate, so Joe Biden, is the president pro tempore, which sort of serves kind of in a similar way as the Speaker of the House, sort of. He's still a very specific sort of sub leader for the Senate, but without all of the powers and the ability to have all of the reputation really as the Speaker of the House does. And the president pro tempore for the Senate, of course, is Orrin Hatch. He's a Republican because the Republican Party has a majority. It's sort of interesting if you look at this page because most of the majority leadership here, of course, are all Republicans because they have the majority, but the president of the Senate is a Democrat, right? Because the president right now of the United States is a Democrat. Kind of an interesting situation. Leads to a certain amount of conflict, right? And a certain amount of lack of smoothness in getting things done because there's a little bit of a party division there. But we'll examine a little bit about what kinds of effects that has a little bit later. So at this time, the Senate also has majority leaders and majority whips. They operate exactly the same way as the majority leader and the majority whip does in the House of Representatives. Majority leader for the Senate is Mitch McConnell. Majority whip is John Cornyn. You've may have seen Mitch McConnell on the news before. You may have recognized his face. John Cornyn, probably not so much. But again, the leader is just sort of the leader. The whip tries to get everybody to do the thing that the Republican Party wants them to do. They also are, the majority party is also in charge of electing a chairman of conferences. They connect with some of the policy committees, and they, of course, just like with the House, are in charge of the senatorial campaign committee for Republicans. And now for Democrats, because they are the minority party, they don't have a pro tempore, right? That's just a majority party thing. But the minority party does have a minority leader and does have a minority whip, which again does exactly the same stuff as the minority leader and the minority whip in the House. Just here it's the Senate. And so here we have Harry Reid, and Dick Durbin is the minority whip. And then, of course, they also have, their own chairman of conferences. They have their own policy committees. Once again, the minority party is in charge of the committee on committees for the Senate. And then also they are in charge of their Democratic senatorial committee. Really, you'll probably have some questions about what these committees are. And we're actually going to spend a little bit more time looking at those once we get into part 2. But as for right now, we've taken a look at the structure, and this is where we will stop this particular session for today.